The fluorescent lights of the ICU were harsh, unforgiving, and they seemed to reflect the panic surging through me. I could barely keep my vision steady as I clutched the hospital bed railing, trying to ignore the blood that soaked my sleeve and the dizziness that threatened to knock me off my feet. The machines around me beeped in a rhythm I couldn't comprehend, yet each sound felt like an accusation, a reminder of how fragile everything had become. I could feel my pulse hammering not just from the blood loss but from the tension that had been building for weeks, tension that now reached a breaking point. Through the haze, I heard my mom's voice, sharp and unusually calm considering the chaos. "Call Grandpa," she said, as if summoning him could somehow fix the reality of me bleeding on a hospital bed. Her words were like ice in my veins. I had never expected her to respond with practicality instead of panic. I wanted to scream at her, to demand some semblance of empathy, but the pain was too overwhelming. The decision she implied hovered over me like a storm cloud. Grandpa would be involved, and somehow, money was expected. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, each movement causing another wave of dizziness. The memory of our past interactions flooded back. Grandpa had always been powerful, influential, untouchable, someone whose word could move mountains. But his generosity had always come with strings that were rarely visible until it was too late. I knew the stakes the moment I pressed his number. I could almost hear him on the other end, calm, commanding, entirely in control. "Grandpa," I managed to croak, my voice weaker than I intended. I could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background, a sign that he was ready, waiting for whatever came next. I need your help." My words sounded pitiful even to my own ears, but it was the truth. I was trapped, bleeding, and uncertain whether my strength would last long enough to navigate the conversation that would follow. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to feel my chest tighten with anxiety. Then, in his usual tone of quiet authority, he asked, "How much?" The question hit me like a hammer. How much? I wasn't just asking for help, I was negotiating survival. My mom's earlier insistence echoed in my mind. There was no room for hesitation. The answer came before my conscious mind could even protest: $500,000. $500,000. I didn't have it, but Grandpa always did, and I knew there would be consequences, strings that would tighten like a noose later. The transaction was swift, clinical. My mom handled the transfer, her expression unreadable, while I sat there, drained, barely able to comprehend the gravity of what I was doing. Each moment felt surreal, like a film playing in slow motion. Blood still pressed against my clothes, the hospital machines still beeped around me, and yet the reality of money, power, and family obligations swirled in a dizzying blur. The ICU room, the doctors, my pain, they all became secondary to the invisible negotiation happening just beyond the sterile walls. Once the call ended and the money was transferred, I felt an odd mix of relief and dread. The immediate danger had been addressed, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. My mom's eyes met mine, devoid of the warmth I had once expected. There was gratitude. No, there was calculation, expectation, a silent message that my act of giving wasn't the end, it was a repayment, a sacrifice demanded by circumstance and family hierarchy. Even in that haze, a spark of defiance flickered inside me. I realized that while I had acted in desperation, the situation had also revealed the truth of our family dynamics. Grandpa's influence was undeniable, my mom's priorities were clear, and I was left with the bitter understanding that love, in this household, was transactional. Yet something in me refused to remain entirely compliant. I knew that paying $500,000 wasn't just a surrender, it was a statement. It was an acknowledgement of the reality I was living in, but it also planted the seed of what I could do next, of how I could reclaim control once I regained strength. As the hours dragged on and the nurses attended to my wounds, I allowed myself a fleeting moment of clarity. I could survive this, not just physically but strategically. The money, the call to Grandpa, the tense stares of my mom, they had all been part of a system I didn't fully control. And while I had acted according to their expectations, I was already thinking about the steps I would take once I could stand on my own feet. The room settled into an eerie quiet. Machines hummed steadily, and my own breathing began to normalize. The bleeding had slowed, thanks to the doctors, and the immediate danger passed. But the events of that day had etched themselves into my mind, a reminder that survival often required sacrifices that tested more than just the body, they tested loyalty, courage, and the willingness to confront the complexities of family power. I knew, deep down, that giving $500,000 had been necessary, but it was only a prelude to the real choices I would soon have to make. In that moment, lying in the stark ICU room, I understood something crucial: the next move would define everything. And I was determined that it would not be dictated by fear, pain, or obligation, but by my own resolve. The moment the transfer of $500,000 was confirmed, a strange calm settled over me, but it was deceptive. Relief mingled with a sharp, simmering anger that I hadn't expected. The immediate danger was gone. I had survived the ICU, the blood loss, the fear, but the realization hit me like a thunderclap. Handing over $500,000 had given them temporary satisfaction, but it had not solved the deeper problem. If anything, it had revealed the true stakes in my family, and I could no longer ignore the power dynamics that had controlled my life for too long. As soon as the doctors allowed me to sit up, I began thinking. Every conversation, every decision up to that moment suddenly made sense. The manipulations, the subtle pressures, the cold calculations, it all connected. My mom had never been motivated purely by concern for my health. She had wanted leverage, and Grandpa's involvement had been the perfect tool. But the more I reflected, the more I realized that I had a chance, an opening, to reclaim control in a way that no one had anticipated. The bleeding, the ICU, the money, they had all been catalysts. I started with careful observation, listening and watching the interactions of everyone around me. My mom's face remained composed, but I could sense the tension beneath it. She expected compliance, expected gratitude, expected fear. Grandpa, ever the calculating force, assumed his influence was unshakable. He had transferred the money without hesitation, confident that the transaction would secure loyalty. But what they didn't realize was that I was no longer the frightened person lying on the hospital bed. I had survived, and survival had sharpened my mind, my instincts, and my resolve. The first step was strategy. I knew that simply resisting wouldn't be enough. I had to create a plan that would dismantle their expectations without putting myself at further risk. I began documenting everything: conversations, transactions, and actions that showed exactly how manipulative and controlling they had been. I gathered evidence discreetly, making sure nothing could be traced back to me until the moment it would have the maximum impact. Each note, each record, strengthened my sense of purpose. The $500,000 had been a necessary evil, but now it became a tool, a symbol of the leverage I could wield in return. When the opportunity arose, I acted decisively. I confronted my mom first, presenting the facts in a way that left no room for denial. Her eyes widened as I detailed the timeline of manipulation and the financial implications. She had always assumed I would comply indefinitely, that fear and loyalty would override logic. But I could see in that instant that she recognized a shift in power. The confidence she had relied upon was gone, replaced by the realization that I had regained control. Grandpa's reaction was more subtle but no less telling. He attempted to assert authority, to remind me of the influence he still held. Yet I had already anticipated his moves. I had prepared counter-arguments, alternative strategies, and legal support if necessary. His calm demeanor faltered just enough for me to see the cracks in the foundation of his control. The $500,000, meant to buy compliance, had instead become a catalyst for my empowerment. What they thought would secure my submission had, ironically, triggered the very resistance they feared. In the days that followed, I executed the plan meticulously. Every interaction was calculated, every word deliberate. I reclaimed financial autonomy, secured my personal safety, and, most importantly, redefined my relationships with both my mom and Grandpa. Their attempts at subtle intimidation, once so effective, now fell flat. I could see the frustration building in them, the realization that their strategies no longer held sway. Each small victory reinforced the larger goal: to end the cycle of control and manipulation that had dominated my life for so long. The most satisfying moment came when the larger consequences of my actions became apparent. Family allies who had remained silent or complicit began to recognize the shift in dynamics. Those who had underestimated me adjusted their behavior, some in fear, some in reluctant respect. The power that had seemed untouchable, the $500,000, Grandpa's influence, my mom's manipulation, was no longer absolute. I had taken a situation designed to weaken me and transformed it into a turning point, proving that survival was not enough, reclaiming agency was essential. By the time the dust settled, the family structure had changed dramatically. I had established boundaries, reinforced my independence, and, perhaps most importantly, reasserted my dignity. The experience in the ICU, the bleeding, the fear, it all felt like a prelude to a much larger awakening. The $500,000, intended to intimidate or control, had been the spark that enabled me to see clearly, act decisively, and ultimately break free from the invisible chains that had constrained me for years. Looking back, I realized that true power did not come from money, influence, or fear. It came from understanding the system, anticipating the moves of others, and having the courage to act when the stakes were highest. The $500,000 had been a means, not an end. What I did next, carefully, strategically, and with unwavering resolve, ended everything they had assumed would control me. In the end, it wasn't just survival that mattered. It was transformation, the ability to turn vulnerability into strength and fear into empowerment. And that was a lesson no one in my family could ever undo.